Hello, everybody. I'm Dan Liebenson, and I'm here again with B'nai Lappi for this week's episode of the Oral Talmud. Hey, B'nai.
Hey Dan, how are you?
Good. Missed you.
I missed you too.
Um, by the way, for our watchers, we actually see each other more often than once a week, but it's still good to be together doing this in particular. Um, so Vinay, so I think let's jump into it. We are in the middle of a text today, but could you do a little bit of review of just sort of where we're situated so that folks who didn't see last week can fully just get a sense of where we're starting from. I would just say that where our kind of theme, we've just shifted themes from kind of what is the ideal kind of person or the ideal kind of thinker or student or leader that the rabbis of the Talmud were talking about. That was our theme for a bunch of weeks. And now we've shifted to this theme of, as the rabbis start to put together a new system, what are some of the values that they put at the center of that system, and how do they make the transition from a previous system which may not have had those values to one that now does, and how do they kind of maintain that continuity, that sense of continuity? And the one that we're talking about here is this question about breaking Shabbat in order to in order to save a life, which is just, I think we said it last week. I just want to be really clear about it, that it doesn't say in the Torah, like, meaning it seems like in the previous form of Judaism, what you were saying about the Maccabees, like the Maccabees had this innovation that they would go, fight a war on Shabbat, because it seems that previous to that, people had this strong sense of like, no, Shabbat is Shabbat and we don't do anything, right? And
Right.
clearly the Maccabees took a step in saying, well, we at least have to fight a war. I mean, if somebody's trying to kill us, we have to be able to fight back. But then the rabbis are taking it much further.
Yeah. So what I think we're doing is tracing the process of how profound innovations to receive tradition happen. And this piece of Talmud picks up only when the innovation comes into the purview of the rabbis. And I think that the story of the Maccabees, the fact that the Maccabees took it upon themselves to fight on Shabbat, which for sure previously had been understood to be forbidden by the Torah, needs to be the what do you call it? It's not a prologue when there's a TV show, a series, or a movie, and then you get the pre-movie. What's that called?
The prequel?
The prequel, yes, the prequel. That's it. So the Maccabee story is the prequel to this piece of Talmud. And that prequel is that this radical innovation was actually done by people who took it upon themselves to color outside of the lines, whose svara, whose moral intuition and sense of what's really right won the day, and they allowed that to drive their actions. And that typically happens by people on the ground, from the fringes, not from the systemic policy power holders. As little power as the rabbis had, they took, they were kind of imagining a system. But I think the innovations don't start with the system designers. They start with the people on the fringes, and those were the Maccabees. Then the next episode in the story is the movie itself, and that's our Mishnah, which is really the first record in the 3rd century of the rabbis bringing into our legal system the innovations that have happened on the ground that they think are right and that they want to kind of enfranchise into the system. And we see the Mishnah saying, if someone is sick on Shabbat, it's okay to give them medicine, which you would have had to pull from a plant and uproot it from your garden in order to boil. And those activities, the pulling and the boiling, those are generally prohibited on Shabbat. But to save a life, you can do it. Okay, now this is when it becomes law for the first time. And what we know about the Mishnah is it's a characteristically unjustified document. It's super bold. It has new divergent laws with respect to Torah, and it typically doesn't justify those new norms, practices, laws. 400-500 years later in the Gemara seems to have the agenda of, depending on your philosophy, shoring up those radical laws with Torah or other proofs, saying, oh, no, this thing isn't so radical. It's really, what we could have learned out from the Torah anyway. Or if you follow David Kramer, they're trying to do that as a sales pitch, but really showing one another in those, the Hamevin Yavins, those who can understand what's going on, seeing how actually divergent it is. And then, so we moved into the Gemara to watch their process of trying to make the case, the sales pitch, for how, in fact, this idea of violating virtually any law in the Torah to save a life is not only our law, but it always was our law. It's rooted somewhere in Torah. So we have a bunch of rabbis walking along the way, and we have, I think so far we had maybe 6 different volleys at, maybe we could do it this way. No, maybe we could do it that way. Maybe we could tie it to this verse. Maybe we could tie it to that verse. And now we're at the very last.
Well, and some of those were like sort of reasonable, and some of them started to get more into the realm of that's kind of an absurd argument, or that's kind of, and it's interesting. And we talked about it being a little bit like chiastic in the sense of, well, it was, the first one was like, yeah, okay, I could get there. And then they started to get a little bit more absurd, and then they started to get a little bit less absurd. And we won't go over it all again, but if you want to watch last week's episode, that we went into a lot of detail on those.
Yeah, and also you're reminding me something that I learned from my teacher David Kramer, which is if the rabbis have a good answer to something, they give you that answer. If they don't have a single good answer, they give you 10 answers. In other words, the fact that there are 6 or 7 different proofs for how we can really know from the Torah that God all along wanted us to violate Torah to save a life, if there are 6 or 7 different answers, it's also kind of a meta message that it's not really in the Torah. You really can't legitimately think that it's there. This is a process of eisegesis, not exegesis. So
because none of these stories are like, Miriam had leprosy and they calculated that was Shabbat and she was healed, and so therefore we know that you can, there just isn't an easy answer. So something as clear, it's sort of obvious as well. If somebody's like sick and dying on Shabbat, or they might be dying, like, of course we should give them medicine, like something that's sort of, I think probably is like, it's so obvious, like how could that not be the law? What kind of a Judaism would it be if that's not the law? But if you can't find the source for it in some more straightforward way in the Torah, then you're in this kind of situation where you're like, we're going to have to figure out that this is okay, because it can't not be okay. And yet we're trying to make this connection. We're trying not to come off as completely radical. So how are we going to make that connection?
Yeah, and I know we said this last week, but I want to remind us that this idea that you can break a law to save a life, at this point, 2,000 years into this idea, feels intuitive to us. It feels obvious that that's what you would do. But we have to get our heads into their heads. And I think it was not at all. I think they were in the mindset of 1,500 years or so of a Torah that said, no, this is what you do. You follow Shabbat regardless. There are no but if this is the situation, you can violate. No, that isn't in the Torah. So it's a very, very, very radical diversion. And I want to bring that up because I think our dilemma today is, how do we insert back into the tradition values that aren't there and innovations that we think should be there, that seem as radical as Pikuach Nefesh did to them, not to us. Right?
Right. So then going back to the text, one thing that I've just noticed that those first 6 examples that we talked about last week, those were Tanaim, meaning that they were rabbis who were alive during the time of before the Mishnah. At least that's what Steinsaltz says. I'm not sure that.
Does he say they're all Tanim? I'm not sure
Well,
if they were
he says other
all.
Tanaim also debated this issue, and then we get but maybe they're not all.
Okay.
But
I-
so maybe they're not. But in any event, the first 3 for sure are. But the next 3, I'm not sure. But then the 7th one definitely is not. This
right.
is an Amora Shmuel, who's one of the most important characters. I don't know that we've met him yet, but he's one of these later Babylonian rabbis who's, there's a lot of them, but there's some that are very important, and they tend to be in pairs. That they were either, that again, who knows really, they were in the story, they were kind of heads of rival yeshivas, or whatever, but they tended to have these pairs that they would have these kind of debates. And Rav, one of them was Rav and one of them was Shmuel. That was one pair. And, we talk quite a bit about Rava. That's a different person than Rav. And his alter ego is Abaye, and so there's a bunch of these pairs, but Shmuel is a very important and recurring character in the Talmud.
Absolutely. And sidebar, Shmuel actually wasn't a rabbi. He doesn't have a title of any sort. And I won't take more time going into this issue, but I actually think it's important. These guys were not all rabbis. We call them rabbis and we kind of refer to them as a class as rabbis. Sages is probably better, even though it's a little awkward, because they weren't all rabbis. And I think it's important to know that to be, what I call a player, to be someone who is shaping, innovating, upgrading the system, you don't need to be a rabbi. You had to have the 2 qualifications of being gamirna and savirna, learning, which for them only meant knowing your Mishnahs. It was about, 100-page book, a teeny tiny book that could fit in your back pocket, very little. And you had to have svara. You had to have this deep sense of moral intuition, of insight into human beings and their relationships and how people work. That's what qualified you to be a player. And Shmuel was one of those people, but he didn't have the title. The title was a relatively minor certification that just gave one indemnification against damages if they made a mistake. So just a minor point. He's not a rabbi. Okay.
Great. Okay, so we'll take a look at the text. So this is that next argument. Rav Yehuda said that Shmuel said, if I had been there among the sages who debated this question, right? Because he's later. So, and these folks were walking along on the road much earlier. But if I had been among them, I would have said that my proof is preferable to theirs, is better than theirs, as it states. The Torah states, "You shall keep my statutes and my ordinances, which a person shall do, and live by them."
Okay, let's stop. Yeah, let's. Great. So let's stop there before we get to what he makes of that. So he was referring to this verse in Leviticus. Sorry, I just jumped in.
No, it's good. Go ahead.
Okay, so he's quoting specifically the words from the verse, live by them. And the entirety of the verse is God saying, here are my laws, here are my ordinances, that you should live by them. And it's pretty clear what live by them means in the Torah. It means something like live according to them, obey them,
Yeah, actually, yeah, I mean, like if I actually have the text from the Torah just so we can see it a little bit in context. That here it is, Leviticus 18. By the way, this is the traditional reading for Yom Kippur, right? Leviticus 18, the afternoon of Yom Kippur, I think. But anyway, so yeah, it is, because what it is that the Lord speaks to Moses, and here it's in verse 5, it says, you shall keep my laws and my rules, by the pursuit of which man shall live. That's how it's translated in this particular translation, but it's translating there these words, v'chai bahem, and you could translate it by which people should live, but you could also translate in you should live by them, like you were saying, like live according to my rules.
Yeah, I think this translation is actually an attempt to retroject back into the Torah a little bit of the way the rabbis are droshing this phrase, live by them.
Uh-huh.
A real simple translation would simply be, you shall keep my laws and my rules and live by them. I
Yeah.
am the Lord.
And
That's it.
yeah, and the only other thing that I really want to point out here, just so that people can put this into context, is that what follows that is all of these rules and regulations around, quote, uncovering the nakedness, right? This means like various like sexual prohibitions, including the famous line of that's been interpreted by certain elements to say that men shouldn't have gay sex, but like this is that where that comes from. This whole bunch of sexual practices that you shouldn't do. So that's all to say that this text, in context, has to do apparently, right, with all these like sexual practices that you shouldn't engage in. So not only is it kind of translated, right, that it means basically a simple translation, like you should just live, you should like live by these words, like meaning you should follow my rules. But then the specific rules that are listed are all these particular sexual rules, meaning like this wasn't some general statement that was saying, like, it wasn't one of the 10 commandments. It's in a very particular context in the Torah.
Mm-hmm. And it's clear that the simple plain meaning of the words v'chai bahem, live by them, means live according to them. And here come the thems. Live according to these.
Right.
These are my rules, and here are a bunch of them.
Right.
Great.
Here's a bunch that are on my mind right now.
Right. Okay, so then we get to Shmuel's read of these words v'chai bahem. What he's saying is, no, God didn't, when God said live by them, God didn't mean live according to them. He meant live by them and don't die by them.
Mm-hmm.
So, in other words, these are my laws that you should do only to the extent to which you're doing them allows you to keep living.
Right.
That's what God meant to say when God said live by them. Only do them if you continue to live in the doing of them.
Right.
But don't follow my laws and regulations and ordinances if they're going to cause your death.
Right.
Which is absolutely a radical divergence, I think, from what the text actually meant. If you have this philosophy of Torah that the text probably means what it says it means, kind of in a Rabbi Yishmaelian sense. But Rabbi Akiva says, no, the text doesn't only mean what it looks like it means in a potentially infinite number of other things, including the exact opposite of what it apparently means.
Right. So let's look at that in context, just to see what you just said. Right. So Shmuel says you should, he's reading this line from Leviticus: "You shall keep my statutes and my ordinances, which a person shall do and live by them, and not that he should die by them."
Yep.
In all circumstances, one must take care not to die as a result of fulfilling the mitzvot. That's Steindeltz's explanation. And then Rava comments, all of these arguments have reputation except for that of Shmuel, which has no refutation. So just to be clear on that, Rava is a later, very important rabbi. We talked about him a lot. He's the hero of Svara. And Rava means the rabbi. So, the guy who the Talmud calls the rabbi is most likely the most important rabbi. And that guy comes along and hears this story and he says, yeah, that's the one. That's the one that this is really based on. The other ones you could argue with, you could refute, but this one you can't. What could you say against this? Well, I could say a lot, right?
Right, but I think Rava's endorsement and the fact that the Talmud doesn't bring any challenge to this read sets this this midrash, these two words from the Torah and the way they're read as a kind of ultimate litmus test. I don't know if litmus test is the right word, but a kind of yardstick for should I or shouldn't I? And just the fact that the Torah has now been turned into a should I or shouldn't I in every instance. In other words, the individual is now in possession of their own criterion over whether I should follow this mitzvah, that mitzvah, or the other mitzvah. And the criterion is this going to allow me to keep living, or is this going to cause my death? And it's not a big step from is this going to cause my death or allow me to live to is this going to suppress my lifeness? Is this going to enhance my lifeness? Now, I don't want to get to a kind of, is eating this cheeseburger going to enhance my life? Oh yeah, I love cheeseburger. You know what I mean? I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about, I'm talking about some profound question of life enhancement and in a deep sense. As a queer person, this proof is profound for me because every queer person knows if I follow Leviticus 18:22, which is just a few verses ahead, one of those things, that's going to be spiritually killing, deadening in a profound way, in a way that, not eating that cheeseburger is not about. It's obvious that it isn't, I can't continue living in a way that I think God wants me to live. And as the Supreme Court said, the United States wants all individuals to live in the Lawrence decision, right? Kennedy's decision was, we can't, well, anyway, we'll get to that in a minute. V'chai Bahem is just an amazing yardstick, and it makes it obvious that as a queer person, Leviticus 18:22, man shall not lie with a man, can't possibly be incumbent upon me, because if I do it, I am dying. It does increase my death, if not literally, psychically and spiritually.
Well, first of all, that's a beautiful reading that I'm thinking about whether, Steve Greenberg, Rabbi Steve Greenberg, who was the first Orthodox rabbi that came out as a gay man some years ago, many years ago now, 15, 20. And he wrote a book called Wrestling with God and Men, where, among other things, he's really trying to take on that verse and trying to figure out the question of, like, how can I be an Orthodox Jew and have this verse in my life? Like, and he comes up with various readings that are very interesting, including that it's not what there was, that's not, they didn't mean loving sex between two men. This was about an oppressive of if you capture somebody in a war or whatever, there's all kinds of readings about that. It's interesting, I don't remember if he gives the reading that you just gave, which is fascinating because you're talking about the verse whose context is exactly like a bunch, 5-10 verses before in the Torah, that other one. So it's a, what's interesting about the way that you're reading is that it's kind of saying, as we've seen a number of times on this show, like, I go back to this idea that you've said that when a certain name of God is used, the one who spoke and the world came into being, or the Holy Blessed One, that it matters to track when this name of God is used and what that name is God is used, because there are these kind of messages being sent based on things like that. So when you take out of context, right, we talked about, the idea that early, right, in this show, we talked about that story where the mountain is being held over the Jews, and the text that they use to prove that they actually did accept the Torah, even though they didn't have to, is from the book of Esther, which we know is the absurd book in the Torah, the topsy-turvy book. So if you chose the proof text out of that book, that means maybe you were signaling that this is absurd and we know it and we want it, because that's right. We could have found a proof text somewhere else, but we chose not to find it. We chose to find it here. Now, I don't think they were choosing to find the proof text here necessarily in order to get rid of that line about lying with a man. Although maybe, it's interesting, it would be interesting that this is very obviously an area in the Torah with all kinds of sexual prohibitions. Maybe they are saying something about dafka. Why are we choosing from here? Maybe it just happens to be where it is in the Torah. It's very possible. But I think it's very interesting. But whether what that was their intent or not, I think it's very interesting now to say, hey, we've just discovered something that they chose to anchor this principle on a misreading, but a Jewishly important and valid misreading of the Torah that happens to be immediately adjacent to that particular verse. I think it's a really important read, actually.
Yeah, it's interesting. I never really thought about the proximity of these, and I'm not sure, for me, because I really don't think it was bothering the rabbis at all.
Yeah.
But
maybe they were guided by the hand of God.
Maybe.
I did want to go ahead.
And this proof text doesn't need to be in proximity to the things it mitigates. It's so global.
Of course, yes, no, for sure, it's so global. But the fact that it is also in proximity to something, particularly troubling. Yeah, I'm not arguing that this is either intentional on the part of the rabbis or, providential, the hand of God. But there is something powerful. And I mean, I guess if we start to say we're heading into this next era, right, this post-rabbinic era, there are ways in which the rabbis, right, made something out of the fact that things in the Torah were proximal to one another, even though they probably weren't intended to be. And I think that there are ways that we can make some kind of meaning out of things that are proximal in the rabbis, view of the Torah that I think, I don't know, there's something, is it absurd? Is it not really true? I mean, sure, okay. But is it powerful nonetheless? Does it allow us to anchor our sense of what's right today in some version of the tradition? I think it does equally. I find it powerful.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I'm not so convinced by the proximity thing. But what you're also raising is whether these techniques that were great marketing techniques for a new value that they wanted to say was Jewish all along. I'm always asking myself, are these techniques going to be helpful for us? Because people don't have that kind of pietistic relationship with the Torah whereby if someone points out, it says you shall live by them. Oh, that means live by them. And everyone's going to roll their eyes today, at least in liberal communities for sure, and probably many modern Orthodox communities as well. And the question is, what are the techniques that we can use that will be compelling and convincing, or maybe none of the techniques are convincing other than reference to Svara. I mean, Svara was one of the tools that they came up with that they chose to use occasionally, not a lot explicitly, although I am certain, as Elon points out, Menachem Elon, he points out that Svara drives every innovation. Of course it does. You don't try to make a forced read of a verse to get a new idea out unless your moral intuition tells you there's a fix that needs to be made.
Mm-hmm.
But they only named this particular innovation as Svara and not this midrash on this verse. They did that only occasionally. And I think the little that I know about legal system says you really only make those kinds of arguments occasionally because, right?
If you do too often, it breaks down the sense that the system has a rational, is a serious system, as opposed to just storytelling.
Right. But I think that's the situation we're in today. We're in the situation of, okay, this next Judaism, what are the mechanisms for justifying, radical new pieces of Jewishness that have never been there before, and that
Mhm.
we're learning from our lives as Black people, queer people, people with disabilities that need to get Judaized, right?
Right.
If we don't, I don't know. And
Right.
and it might just be Svara. I'm not sure.
Well, I see. This is what I don't know. I don't think I'm necessarily articulating it the best way, or necessarily even seeing it the best way yet. But I think that yes, I agree with you that the simple marketing argument, hey, look, this is proximal to this, that's not. I totally agree with you. Like, people are gonna would roll their eyes and say you're just kind of like a stop clock is right twice a day. But I still do think that people respond powerfully to some idea that this isn't like out of nowhere, that this is
Mhm.
anchored. I come back to Ari Kelman, who's a sociologist, does a lot of kind of demographic studies of the Jewish community, told us a couple of years ago that when they do these kind of studies and they just have people talking about what they like about Judaism or what they don't like, they're not asking them a survey that they've made up in advance. They're just asking them to talk, and then they kind of write down the words that they're using, that the word tradition is very, very, very positive in people's minds. um, but like rules is not, or like when you talk about specific things that you might say as a tradition, they don't like that, but the notion of tradition they like very much. So there's some idea that people do very much want to see that, yeah, I know things have changed a lot, and I know I'm very different, and there are ways in which I don't really see myself here. And yet, oh, you can point out to me that the rabbis would do these kind of manipulations, even things that are funny, like, gematria, where they're doing numerology. Like, no, people don't really believe that the numerology is embedded into the text of the Torah. And yet, if you can show them that, in numerology, this word means this equals this word, and, they're like, oh, that's cool. That gives them a sense of connection to it, I think. So I don't know. I feel like there's a piece in there
Yeah,
somewhere.
yeah, for sure. Um, but maybe the arguments are going to have to be a little bit more subtle and a little
Yeah.
bit less clever.
Yes. Yeah.
Um,
Much more. Like, I think that what they have to do is invite people into the work. In other words, to say, like, it's not like I'm not trying to sell you on something. I don't think salesmanship is any part of this in the next era. I think what it is something that I would call like inspiration, like to say, like, I want you to see that what you're hoping for is possible. Maybe I don't quite have the answer for you, but I want to invite you into this process of digging into this stuff, and maybe you'll be the one that comes up with it. But I want to reassure you that the system is not closed to what you're looking for in the system, right? Something
yeah,
like that.
yeah, absolutely.
I wanted
Uh,
to make a couple of like law comparisons to what we're talking about, from American law, because we've talked about Roe v. Wade, for example, a lot in some of these comparisons. And, you know, there are elements of abortion law where it's this question of whether the life of the mother versus the life of the fetus, and a lot of, and you could call that, some objections to that argument is that it's a slippery slope because, okay, so it's the life of the mother. If the mother's definitely going to die, if we don't do the abortion, okay, we could do the abortion. But the problem that, conservatives have is like, well, I don't know if she's definitely going to die. So now you're saying, well, she's probably going to die. Okay, but now already you're asking me to kill what I believe is a life in order for the possibility that maybe, and then you say, well, okay, I'll give it to, then it's like, well, what about if she becomes so depressed because she doesn't want to be a mother, maybe she would commit suicide, right? So, and you can kind of, and then it's like, okay, she's not going to commit suicide, but she's going to be so oppressed and depressed for the rest of her life that it's not really going to be her life anymore. So really her life is over, that as we knew it, and you can kind of go down that slope. And some people say, and therefore we have to hold the line at, you never allow this. And other people say, no, I get that there's a slippery slope. I think I'm among these. I say, like, I get that there's a slippery slope. I understand that you can make those arguments, like where's the stopping point, but that's not how law should work. Like we should say like, okay, so then the answer is better public schools, right? Because better public schools is going to help people be more sophisticated and mature and wise thinkers. And then they'll stop the slippery slope where it makes sense to stop the slippery slope. And that's going to change at different points in time. But what we need is a wise populace. I mean, this is this is like Dewey's idea about like education in a democracy, that in a democracy where people are going to be voting and making the laws, like you have to have a much different and better education system, because you have to get people to be wise enough to make those laws so that you don't have to have these impositions of law that are actually absurd in the other direction, meaning they're preventing, like the Maccabees not going to war on Shabbat. I mean, that's absurd. What they received was absurd in the other direction. It's like you're putting these barriers just so that we can avoid the slippery slope, which is causing all kinds of damage that's not necessary. So that, but just because there's a slippery slope isn't a reason not to change, to allow this more sophisticated view of law to come in, where you say, well, we're going to have to be balancing two important objectives.
Exactly. I agree completely. Slippery slope argument to not expand understandings of what does it mean to die, even, are phobic in the extreme and prevent us from, like you say, doing that hard work of saying, yeah, it's scary, and yeah, it can be abused, but if we don't do it, we have a much worse outcome. We have ridiculous outcomes,
Right.
And you just have to do the work of saying this far, and as far as we can tell, no further. And it'll be up to the next generation to say, and legitimately so, no, actually further because of this, that, or the other thing. And your example of abortion is interesting. It was in my mind as well, to give an example of how Jewish law has expanded its understanding of the permissibility of an abortion on the basis not only of the threat to the mother's physical life, but the threat to the mother's mental and emotional state. I think it was Jacob Emden, a modern posek legal decisor, who said, no, the criterion of tsar gadol, like great distress, is equally valid to permit an abortion even if the actual life of the mother is not being threatened. If she claims, I don't know if I can persevere if I have this child, regardless of whether the child is right, the fetus is viable or not, and whether she's going to physically survive, that mental distress is tantamount to, quote unquote, her dying, and she is allowed to have the abortion. So anyway, that was a very rough, by the way, nobody should take that as law and psak legal decision on abortion. That was a very fast and dirty.
Yeah, I think on this show we're both want to take seriously expertise and also encourage people that it's okay to do your best to understand, arguments, whether they're Jewish or other, and bring them into this conversation, and then we'll all learn more over time. It's fine, But I also wanted to bring in two sort of ideas that connect to American law, because, and I bring them in because I think there's a lot of people that respect American law, or Anglo-American law, or whatever. They're lawyers. They've been taught to, and kind of have some notion that Jewish law or Jewish arguments are either not as sophisticated, or that they're sophisticated is the wrong word, but that they're like that they don't allow in various techniques that happen in American law, but that's not the case. And so, for example, you were talking about the absurd results, like in American law, statutory interpretation 101 class, there's a principle of statutory interpretation that says if the interpretation that I am being asked to give to this law leads to absurd results, then that cannot be the right interpretation. That's not a rule. Like other people say, no, it can be, and therefore then Congress should change the law to fix it. But other interpreters say, no, we should always interpret laws against an absurd result. And that's when we know the lawgiver, that's when we know that the lawgiver is dysfunctional and very much could have screwed it up and caused absurd results, right? And it may therefore actually be emphatically a wrong reading of the law to read it so as not to produce absurd results, because maybe it was just a screw up by Congress, and therefore we're actually misreading it based on what they meant. But that's a valid and well-known rule of interpretation in American law. So that's just one piece. But the more profound one that I wanted to bring in here was this idea that's kind of a statement across the board. The Supreme Court makes it occasionally, that the Constitution is not a suicide pact. And it's this idea that I think like the original notion of it had to do to some extent with Thomas Jefferson making the Louisiana Purchase, because he actually had no authority to execute the Louisiana Purchase under the Constitution. And his point of view was basically like, but how could I not? Like, meaning like this, we got a one-time chance to buy, this incredible amount of land for cheap, and like, it's got to be that we can do this. So I'm just going to do it. And, I'm going to kind of say, like, clearly any reading of the Constitution that would say that we can't buy this enormous piece of land for a good price, that otherwise it's going to have an enemy on the border that's going to be able to attack us. Like, that can't be right. So, of course, somehow I have this power, even though I can't quite tell you what it is, and then out of that, and by the way, that maybe connects to the penumbras and emanations business that we've talked about in terms of abortion and all of that, because it's a similar idea. It's like, look, does it say that there's a right to privacy? No. But is it so clear that there's a right to privacy based on all these other rights? Yes. So in one case, Thomas Jefferson just kind of doesn't say a whole lot. In another case, they say penumbras and emanations. And in other cases, the Supreme Court says the Constitution is not a suicide pact. And that means that if you're going to try to interpret the Constitution in a way that is going to bring about great harm to the country itself, that can't be right. And so we're going to read it a different way. And that's how I kind of read this, that I don't even know if you need the hook of the Chayvahim, right? And that might just be a little flourish. I think you could imagine Shmuel just saying, I actually don't have a hook, but the Torah is not a suicide pact. And so if so therefore it's just svara. I mean, by the way, that's what you were saying, right?
That's it.
But maybe you were saying like we shouldn't say that too often, right? Because then the system starts to fall apart. But in this particular case, it might have been one of those cases where you just say like, of course, the Torah is not a suicide pact. So any rule in the Torah, if you have to read it to say unless you would die, right? And that's just a principle that could be Rabbi Ishmael's 14th, interpretive principle, is just like add unless you would die to every law, because of course,
right.
But in either way, whether there's a hook or not a hook, it's a very well-established principle of legal interpretation to say that, this is not the case if it would cause us to die.
Does secular law have a word for svara, right? So the way I understand how svara works in the Jewish legal system is, it is the elevation to a source of law equal in authority to Torah, to use one's deep sense of what's right.
Right.
That has to be informed by deep learning. That's the Gamirna piece, and has to be informed by broad exposure to lots of different kinds of people and the world. But when you have those two pieces, that sense of, I can't imagine a God who would want, or I can't imagine a world where this makes sense, or look at the suffering that this causes. I can't imagine God would want that to happen. That kind of moral intuition is what the rabbis call svara. And but I've never seen a Supreme Court decision actually name when they use svara. And the Kennedy decision for me is straight up svara.
I think
in the Lawrence case.
But I think there is, and I think that they do name it. The question is, I think it might actually be so inbuilt into the Anglo-American legal system that you almost don't have to name it. But I think that there are two things that I think about when you ask that question. One is what is called public policy, and the other is what's called equity. And it's not necessarily the case that that exactly means svara, and I think it doesn't. But I think that it's used when svara would be used in the Jewish legal system. So the idea of law and equity, as I understand it, so when I say equity, I don't mean equality. I mean that in the way that the Anglo-American legal system is set up, it's based on what in Old England there were two kinds of courts of law and courts of equity. I can't always hold all of this in my head and remember all the details, but my basic understanding is that there were two kinds of courts in England. This is before the United States existed, and they basically came from the power of the king, because everything came from the power of the king. Um, there were courts of law, which is like the king says what the law is, and I guess eventually Parliament says what the law is. And those are the courts where you say, well, the law says, that you can't trespass on my land, and this guy trespassed on my land, so he should have to pay a fine, or he should have to, do whatever. And they would kind of hear the facts of the case and say, yeah, you broke the law. You should pay the fine. But then the other courts were the courts of equity, and they basically were built on the king's power of mercy and pardon power, basically what we might think of as like the pardon power, and where you could go to the king and you could say like, yeah, I broke the law, but like this punishment is too severe, or I had a good excuse. It's not in any law book, but you're the king, so you could kind of let me off. And the king could do that, of course. But then at a certain point, the king said, like, well, I got too much work here, and so the king sets up courts of equity that are basically able to take cases like that when there's not a law on the books, and they can kind of just resolve it based on justice, right, or equity. And so I think that in the United States and also in England, over those two courts eventually merged. So there weren't separate courts of law and separate courts of equity anymore. It's just that courts have the power of law and equity. And so, and I think that sometimes that gets stated as public policy, meaning especially when it's bigger issues where the court will say, like, again, maybe the law could be read in a certain way, but it wouldn't make sense for the objectives of the law to read it that way. And so from a perspective that part of our role is to protect or to have a reasonable public policy, we're going to decide the case the other way. And so I think that functionally those give judges in the Anglo-American system leeway. And so I think people have a misunderstanding that judges should be these like mechanical, law, and John Roberts has talked about being an umpire. I mean, there's something to that, but it's also a little bit, I mean, maybe an umpire also at the margins can decide if something's really a ball or a strike, but I think that judges are supposed to be a little bit more than an umpire, and that's okay. That's part of the system. And I think that's what basically svara is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that sounds right. Is the term judicial discretion part of this picture, or is that something different altogether?
I'm not sure. I think judicial discretion is more like, for example, in sentencing, when it's actually part of the law that says that the judge doesn't have, the judge can decide within a certain range. Or I'm not 100% sure about exactly how that term is used, but I think that I think that fundamentally, look, conservatives often will say something like the Lawrence decision, like they'll say that Kennedy, was just hand waving, meaning that he was doing something fundamentally wrong by, quote, not following the law, or by substituting his discretion for the law, but actually that's not wrong. I mean, you could disagree. You could say that judges do it too often or whatever, but it's not foreign to the legal system. Like, the legal system doesn't imagine that judges don't do that. That's actually part of it, and it should be part of it. And again, that's where I think svara, that's what I think svara is fundamentally. And then the question is with svara, right? It's like you've said many times, it's a dangerous idea. So how do you limit svara? How do you limit equity so that it doesn't overwhelm law? Because if people start to feel that the law doesn't really mean anything because you can always come to a court and they'll let you off. I mean, by the way, this is also in the jury system. There's this idea of jury nullification, right? Where the jury, for example, in a criminal trial, the jury has to come to a unanimous verdict. There's nothing really to stop a juror from saying, well, I know that he really committed the crime, but I'm not willing to vote for conviction because I think that he was, that the police did the wrong thing, or that, that this person was just had a horrible life or whatever, and juries can sort of nullify the law by just refusing to convict people. If that happens occasionally, some people might yell about it, but other people will say, actually justice was done in this case. If that were to happen all the time, and juries would never convict because they would just always be swayed by the sympathy of the defendant or whatever, you would start to get this feeling like it's gone too far, and you would probably get some corrections into the system. So those things exist, but it's scary because, first of all, you want to make sure that people use them wisely, but the other is that if people use them too much, the people won't accept the system anymore, and that could lead to anarchy. I mean, potentially, right? That's the fear.
Right. Yeah, I think it's really important to understand that Jewish law works like any legal system that survives for a long period of time. And it does so by the same mechanisms. And those mechanisms are the human insight that is brought to bear to modify, qualify, limit, expand the law as one receives it. And it so pisses me off that we're taught that the Torah is what it is. It says what it says, and that's the end of the story. And I don't know, why do we teach people that? Because it's not true. It's really the beginning of the story, not the end of the story. And if you think that's the case, if you think that there actually aren't ways to even, quote unquote, change the Torah, then you have only two options. When your kishkis tell you that something in the Torah, violates your sense of what's right, you can either suppress your really valuable insight and say, no, I'm going to go along with this thing and stay, shut up, or you can leave. You can go, I'm right and it's wrong, and you leave. And at some point we got into that binary, and I think part of my project is really just telling people that's not the way it works. So those aren't your only two options. There's a third option that we've been using for the last 3,500 years, particularly the last 2,000 years. And this is how it works. Come be a player in working the system this way and making Judaism better.
Well, so my question is like whether that is by design or by accident. And I think it's both. I think it's different in different communities. I was actually just having a conversation the other day with somebody who was talking about how, I don't remember now the example, but his rabbi was saying that he was troubled by something in the Torah, in the Parshat Shavua, the weekly Torah reading. He was troubled by it, and I kind of said, like, I don't know why you should be troubled by it. Like, the rabbi solved that 2,000 years ago. Like, the rabbi said, we don't do that anymore. That's over. I don't. It wasn't the Ben Tzurah Moreh, which we'll get to at some point. The what? How do we translate that? The
stubborn and rebellious son.
Stubborn and rebellious son. That you're supposed to stone to death in the Torah. Like, it wasn't that, but it was something like that. And I was like, but the rabbi said that was over 2,000 years ago. So you could be troubled that we ever had this idea, sure, but like, right. We don't have it anymore. We haven't had it for 2,000 years. Why are we talking about this? And we had this conversation, and the person said, well, maybe it's because of lack of education. It's because even in rabbinical school, they don't really learn Talmud in a deep way. And I'm like, okay, but so then why not? Is that because the question is that like by design, meaning that's like people are afraid to teach those ideas because they are afraid that will make the system fall apart. And even though, we're talking about liberal Judaism here, but there's still this desire to kind of hold the line. And so we don't want to actually teach these techniques because, it might go too far. Or is it because like we just like aren't good at Jewish education anymore, and we just like didn't have time or whatever, and people just didn't really learn these things. And it wasn't because nobody wanted them to know. Is just that they were incompetently taught. In a different part of the Jewish world, and let's say the more ultra-Orthodox part of the Jewish world, you could imagine that there's more of a intentional desire not to teach certain ideas, like the more radical vision of Svara, because they actually don't want people to do that, because that's not the kind of Judaism they practice. Okay, at least that you could understand, within that system it doesn't serve their interests, so they would be intentionally holding it back. But in the more liberal Jewish world, it feels like, I don't know, is it intentional, or is it just sad because it's just a sad story about lack of education leading to a reprioritization of the Torah? The Torah is the only thing that people have really studied. Okay, but the fact of the matter is that I don't know what a good example. I mean, I suppose it's an example of it is maybe it is a good example of reading things in the Constitution. There are horrible things in the Constitution. The 3/5 clause. There are all kinds of terrible things in the Constitution. They remain terrible. Of course, we should be troubled by them, and they have continuing reverberations. So we should definitely continue to be troubled by them. And at the same time, if you just read that and didn't bother to read the amendments, you would be getting a completely wrong idea of at least what the Constitution says today. You could still say it's not really being lived up to, et cetera. But okay, if it's not being lived up to, then all the more powerful your arguments. But if you just pretend like you didn't even know there were amendments, and that's basically what's happening in Judaism. People are basically reading the Constitution, saying, "Oh, I didn't know there were amendments."
Right, exactly. Exactly. I don't know. I just think it's funny that in shul we put the Torah in the ark and we parade it around. That's kind of silly to me.
Yeah.
What? I mean, if we're going to parade anything around as the tradition that we're venerating, it should probably be the Talmud.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And like you say, then have the issue of where are we in conversation with that version of the tradition, and where are we pushing back, and where are we overriding it? I don't know.
Yeah. I mean,
I have one more thought. A piece of this, the answer to this question, I think, is who's holding up the tradition and how much is it working for them? When I went to rabbinical school, I think the general message for us as students was your job is to get people to keep kosher and observe Shabbos.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And as many of the other mitzvot as possible. The goal was compliance, and the system is good. We need better marketing, but it's a really good system. It works, and your job is to get people to see how good it is and to observe it. There was not a great sense of, we need to fix this thing. It's broken, and we're going to teach you how to fix it. So without people who are saying, hey, this is broken in a lot of ways, there isn't going to be an emphasis on the tradition of fixing, the history of fixing, the mechanisms of fixing, the role of fixing. Mm-hmm. So, I still think the people who go to historically have been going to rabbinical school are the wrong people. The people going to rabbinical school, and it's increasingly happening, especially as those who come through places like Svara get turned on and go to rabbinical school. But the people going to rabbinical school should be the people for whom the tradition works least well. They're the ones who are going to say, okay, I know where it's broken. And it's really broken, not just for, the super queer, fringy folk like me. It's broken for everybody. But it's super clear for me. And I want to know how to roll up my sleeves and do the fixing. And so rabbinical school curriculums have to change, and the people that are coming in have to change, and the mindset of the people teaching needs to change to say, hey, our agenda is not compliance anymore. Not right now, it's not. It has to be, okay, we're technicians, we're world creators, we're, revisionarying people. I don't know.
Well, Disney calls them Imagineers, right? But
yeah.
But I mean, maybe that's where, like, and my question then is, and we've talked about this for years, right? Is like, can that happen, right? Or do we just need a new kind of school, a new kind of position in Jewish life? Because you talk in your talks about how, if you're drawing your salary from the old system, you're not going to be going to the new system. So, and I wonder, like, is it enough to have Svara graduates going to rabbinical school, or ultimately is the rabbinical schools are going to tweak their curriculum, but are they really going to completely overhaul them? I mean, I don't know. I would love if they did, but I mean, like, at what point, or how much has to happen till the old system? And I'm not just pointing the finger at rabbinical school, all the components of the old system. At what point do they say, like, yeah, like, this is an advanced state of collapse, like, we need to do the next thing, and we're all going to agree on that, and we're all going to revise everything? Or is the way that it really happens that, like, a new school is created, and new, we've laughingly called them shmabbis, graduate from them, and people start following the shmabbis and not the rabbis, and eventually the rabbis say, oh, we better jump on that bandwagon because that's where it's going. And by the way, I think that that's what happened with the priests when the rabbis got started. There were various rabbis who were so and so HaKohen. There were some priests who said, I got to jump on there, but they didn't call themselves priests. They didn't go to, like, priest school. I mean, obviously they couldn't because it was hereditary. But but I wonder about that. That's the part that I just wonder whether, Bill Clinton, right, said there's nothing that's wrong with America that can't be fixed with what's right with America. But I wonder if that's true. I mean, I wonder whether sometimes it's like, it's something external is the fix.
I know, me too. And I'm haunted by Audre Lorde's words, and I'm gonna mess up this, so it's going to be a paraphrase. But Audre Lorde said, "The master's house cannot be dismantled using the master's tools." You can use the master's tools to, to tweak, to better, but you're not going to dismantle it. And I don't know.
Yeah.
But it's a constant question in my head. It's a constant question for us at Svara.
Yeah.
Should we be the place where this new set of people are learning in a new way for a new goal, for the creation of a new Judaism? That's one of our big questions.
Yeah, and I think that as we continue on this series where we're looking at the process in which the rabbis started to add these new perspectives, these new values, I think that question lingers. That question will stay with us as to, can we understand what the rabbis were doing? To what extent were they, tweaking, fixing? To what extent were they building something, like, profoundly new? And that's why, like, I pointed out in the beginning of the story that it's, three rabbis and two students walking on the way, walking on the path. That was probably how it was. Like, it wasn't, there were no impressive academies. It was a bunch of, people walking around chatting. Like, this was a very, very new system. And maybe that's kind of how this goes. So it'll be interesting to keep tracking that. I wanted to close just by reading the last part of this story, because it ends in a cute way. There's a bunch that we skipped about how each of the other proofs are refuted, but you can read that on your own. But at the end it says that it says that the proof that Shmuel brought, there certainly is no refutation. And Ravina, an even later rabbi, said, and some say it was Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak who said, regarding Shmuel's proof, one spicy pepper is better than a whole basket of squash, which I love. I think that's one of these quotes that we can take into the future. And I think there's something there, right? I mean, there's something like, you can have this whole world of, kind of, we could call it today parv, kind of interpretations, parv kind of thinking, but, like, that spicy pepper, that's the one that's really gonna be the one that ultimately one day people are gonna look back and say, yeah, that was how it went. There was no refutation there. And by the way, it may be that that's the answer to our question about the 7 different proof texts that were used here, the 7 different ways to try to prove that we had, that saving a life does overcome Shabbat. the answer was like, this was the spicy pepper. This was the one that like made the taste. This is the one that people said, yeah, like I'm getting behind that one. I mean, it's nothing more than
Yeah.
that. It's not that they couldn't be refuted. I mean, they show how the other ones could be refuted and this one couldn't, but it could be. Oh, come on. And we could refute this in 3 seconds. It was just like, that was the one. It was like, yeah, that's the one. It's like, this Constitution's not a suicide pact, of course.
Yeah.
The spicy pepper.
Yeah. I love that. I
So
love it.
so I'm gonna linger on that spicy pepper for the rest of the week, and we'll be back next week with another text.
Okay, great.
All
So
right.
fun.
Thanks, Benay. It's fun being with you. See you next week.
Thanks, then. Okay.
Bye.
Bye.